recording. All right. So yeah, just a few. I'll get the logistical stuff out of the way, and maybe a few more people will find their way here by the time the interesting stuff starts. So we are recording, and we're muting, I think, most people's videos automatically. But if you want to mute your own video, if you don't want to be on the recording, or if you want to grab a hat or whatever you want to do, it will be recorded to distribute later on YouTube. We're using, or I think we're using the live transcript. Keith, do we have the live transcript thing? Maybe I'm supposed to activate it.
Do you want us all to stay on unmuted and video if we're the four of us?
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to have all the panelists stay unmuted for the first 45 minutes, and everybody else will be muted. And then we're going to open it up for audience questions from either the chat or having people use the raise hand function, and we'll unmute them rather than having people unmute themselves, I think is the plan that Keith and I put together. So now, okay, so we've got live transcript on and recording on. All right, what other tech stuff? Right, and we're keeping everybody but the panelists muted for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll selectively unmute for questions. Oh, and I'm also, if anybody starts a question with "this is more of a comment than a question," I'm going to mute you automatically. That's my rule by fiat. Okay, so and I've dropped in the chat. So the book that we're talking about, Food Fights, which I'll say more about in a minute, is being made available by UNC Press. For a discounted price, 40% off. And so there's a discount code, and it's only if you buy it with a credit card from their website, but it's slightly under $20 with the discount before shipping. So if you're interested in picking up the book. But what are we doing here? So this event is being hosted by a food studies research methods class at the University of Michigan. And we're looking at just all the different ways that people try to know things about food. And we're starting our unit on food history with the pair of essays by Rachel Laudan and Ken Alabala that conclude this book, Food Fights, which I just told you about the discount code, and can also tell you that we just didn't get to do any publicity for this. So Chad was going to come up, one of the editors of this, and do an event in Ann Arbor last April, but then the pandemic happened. So when I was thinking about inviting Ken and Rachel, I was also like, oh, maybe I can kind of do another version of this book event. And we had both been on Eat This Podcast with Jeremy Cherfas in the last year, and I don't have any sense of moderation. I just always want more people to join every party. So I invited them all, and they all said yes, and here they are. So I'm going to introduce the panelists for those who don't already know them. Rachel Laudan completed her PhD in the history and philosophy of science at University College London, and her landmark books on food history, The Food of Paradise, Exploring Hawaii's Culinary Heritage, and Cuisine and Empire, Cooking and World History, were both instantly recognized and given all the awards for being the mammoth achievements that they are, both in terms of their meticulous accounting for the complexities and incongruities of how local cuisines develop, and also tracing their millennial and globe-spanning movements over time. Her 2001 essay, A Plea for Culinary Modernism, went viral in 2011 when it was republished in Jacobin, and I've been assigning it just whenever I can because I think it's about the most insightful and electrifying 6,000 words on food history that anybody has ever strung together. At the end of that piece, she calls for, quote, an ethos that comes to terms with contemporary industrial food instead of a, quote, timorous Luddism. And I was delighted when I got invited to contribute something on food and social class to this volume, in part because I found out that none other than Ken Alabala had penned a retort that was anything but timorous. Instead, he claimed the mantle proudly, a full-throated defense of culinary Luddism. Ken Alabala has written, co-authored, or edited approximately 11,000 books. I was just making fun of him about that, ranging from the landmark Eating Right in the Renaissance to single-volume histories of pancakes and beans, and truly wonderful cookbooks like The Lost Arts of Hearth and Home, and every possible iteration of noodle soup. And he's got forthcoming books on Jell-O and The Professor Cooks Breakfast. The Jell-O one is why his Wikipedia page calls him Professor of History and Cultural Ambassador for Aspectopia at the University of the Pacific. And we also have with us one of the two brilliant thinkers who had the idea to put these essays together at the end of this volume, and who is also an expert on food history himself, particularly the history of wine consumption in Britain. Chad Ludington's first book, The Politics of Wine in Britain, A New Cultural History, explores the fascinating intricacies of how the changing English and Scottish preferences for Bordeaux wine, port, and eventually sherry were influenced by all kinds of factors, from familiarity to political allegiances to social class to gender, which is why his contribution to this volume is a really nice complement to mine with its single-minded focus on social class. But we do have some different ideas about objectively good taste, some of which we were invited to talk about on Eat This Podcast by Jeremy Cherfas, our last panelist, who, in addition to hosting that twice James Beard nominated Oral Delight, also does, in my humble opinion, really important work, in his words, being a translator. He says, I speak science and I speak English, and I work hard to make the two understand one another. That's a hard task and an important one. He's a biologist by training, focused mostly on food and agriculture with side interests in economics and many other things, as listeners of his erudite and wide-ranging podcast will already be well familiar. And I'm Margot Finn, and I wrote a book called Discriminating Taste, and I am a unionized non-tenure track lecturer at the University of Michigan, where I teach about food. And this is a submarine that my son Fielding drew specifically for this event. So without further ado, we're going to dive into the questions that my students came up with for our panel. I'm going to start with a big picture one that I think really grows beautifully out of the new postscript that's only in this volume to Rachel's piece, where she talks about how the differences in culinary philosophy, or she says, our ideas about what is just, fair, healthful for the body and earth, and tasty have always shaped how we eat. Or what Marvin Harris might have said, food must be good to think before it can be good to eat. So on the philosophies underlying this debate, Katie asks, how do the differing ideas of culinary Luddism and culinary modernism point to differences in philosophical perspectives of human nature? What intersections can be made in the two theories and how you see human pleasure and satisfaction as it relates to food? And I think that's got to be one for either Ken or Rachel. I don't know which one of you wants to go.
I'd love to jump in if that's okay. Let me just say one brief word that the audience might not know is that Rachel and I have been discussing this topic for a few decades, at least, a long time. And our discussion has kind of developed over the years. And I still harbor the illusion that when she coined the term food Luddite, she had me in mind. But I've embraced that. I know she did, but I pretend she did. And what is the amusing part about this is that actually we agree about most things, really, when push comes to shove. It's just that we've struck this position in what are opposite poles. And obviously her classic article was about not poo-pooing industrial food, and my saying that industrial food ruined pretty much everything. But the irony of all of this is that Rachel really has much more traditional tastes than I do. I have got Cheetos in my cabinet and then tater tots and things that are complete, industrial crap. But I think her tastes are actually, and I think it may have something to do with the fact, and this is definitely a difference in philosophy, the fact that she's just a little bit older than me. And so when she grew up, I think in a family of farming, am I right about that? And I think that when new industrial, modern food came out, it was a time saver and convenient and seemed wonderful. And it was, better than the food in Britain during rationing, obviously. I grew up in the, late 60s, early 70s when I was fed Twinkies and garbage. And I thought, I'd much rather cook the cake myself or bake bread or do something that was, fun and amusing. And so I think that's the very different philosophy is I'd like to be sitting at the matate making corn for an hour, and I have, and it's fun to me, that's pleasure. Whereas Rachel, I think, sees that as a terrible burden for someone who should and can have different opportunities for work and is stuck in their house grinding corn for their family. So that is a very different philosophy, I would say.
My turn?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, we do have very different. I grew up in the kind of family that many people, or family food that many people yearn for, trout from the river and fresh fruit from the garden and milk from the cows and all the rest of it. It was wonderful, and it was also burdensome. I'd like to go back to this word culinary philosophy because I think it's really important. I've thought, is this terribly pretentious? And I don't think it is, because what I am convinced of is that most of the debates we have about what seem to be matters of fact about food, fast food, McDonald's, Monsanto, Walmart, all these issues that come up are not really matters of fact. partly matters of fact, of course, but also partly matters of very basic convictions about politics, about the nature of the world, about the nature of the human being. And that's what Katie's nice question, thank you, Katie, points to. What are being called culinary Luddism and culinary modernism here, I think, are two very different attitudes to society and the role of food in it. I would now call culinary, and I would call culinary modernism a Republican or Democratic tradition. And I think they are very different issues. Let me just sketch them here. The Romantic or Luddite side tends to be more individualistic. It tends to place a lot of weight on direct experience of nature or of food. Ken is very big on direct experience. It tends to put a great deal of emphasis on the role of the artist and the chef as artist, if we're talking about food, or Ken as artist, if we're talking about food, as somebody who can really interpret food and the environment for people. And it tends to see nature, kind of unmediated nature, as a source of inspiration and of truth. The other tradition, the modernism one, which started about the same time, 200 years ago in the Enlightenment, is more concerned, I think, with the civic and social aspects of food, how food plays out in the political or social realm, rather than as food as a source of pleasure, though it doesn't deny that. It places more emphasis on the scientist or the nutritionist as the interpreter of food, and it places it doesn't see nature as something that is unmediated or food. It is much happier to see the transformations that humans make in their environment, including their food environment, as important and valid. If that all sounds a bit abstract, I hope it becomes clearer as we go along. But I think that is actually a very basic set of distinctions that does, in fact, I mean, Ken and I, we agree. I mean, you know, if we went out to eat together, we would enjoy the same kinds of things. But I think there is an underlying distinction there.
That was incredibly helpful. And I think it's pointing me to, I'm going to skip ahead to Madeline's question about how these things, how modernism and Luddism fit in modern life, because I think to zoom back to the philosophies that you just mapped out, especially, and some of the questions about the pandemic, so I'm kind of previewing ahead. A lot of the things people seem to be talking about what's going on with the increase in home cooking and the pandemic, they're falling along kind of both of these philosophies, right? So to one extent, people are talking about comfort and creative expression that they're getting through pandemic baking or whatever, that cooking has become a leisure activity, a hobby, a fun thing for a lot of people. That's very much along the romantic end. But then on the other hand, a lot of people's interest in whether or not people are getting healthier because they're eating home cooked food instead of restaurant food, or like there's some appeals to the more modernist Republican kind of civic concerns about what does the nutritionist say about how we should eat, and are we getting closer to it since we're eating at home instead of at restaurants, and that. So I guess I wonder, so turning to Madeline's question then about how these things fit in modern life, maybe how do we see these philosophies still at work in the ways people are even framing and thinking about whether or not things like home cooking are a good thing today, or can be done within the confines and with the demands of modern life? And I guess to respond to the idea of biography that Ken is talking about, and the issue of like it's more fun to cook if it's not a chore for you, hasn't been a chore for you. So this question about modern life, I think, strikes for me that question about how do these things fit with gender, with who finds cooking pleasurable and why, and for who gets to reap the accolades of being the chef, and who has to do the thankless labor of, you know, making the bespoke quesadilla for each kid who is a picky eater every day in and day out. Okay, yeah, maybe it's both. Maybe, you know, I think I do both too, but I'm going to throw that out. So Madeline's go right. Can culinary modernism and culinary Luddism be balanced within the scope and demands of modern life?
Let's take this. Well, let me just say one of the reviewers for this book criticized me in being sort of elitist and white and male and having the leisure and time to cook. And I think that's true, absolutely. But if you look at the people who use convenience food and fast food and everything, it's not, clear that it's only people in poverty or people of color or anything. It's actually everyone. And in fact, very often it's the people who don't have the most money that have to cook because that's all they can afford is a pot of rice and beans and things. So I don't think that criticism really, I mean, it was taken to imply that I thought, oh, you people are eating fast food and junk because you don't know better and you're in poverty. But actually, no, I think if there's anyone to imitate, it's the people who don't have enough money to eat convenience food, which is expensive. It really is. You eat, obviously vegetables are always expensive, but grains and flour and basic ingredients to cook with are actually much cheaper. And if you have a little bit of time. Now, having said that, I do think we should have a minimum wage, so everyone should have the time. No one should need to have many jobs, and that is a problem in our nation, especially. But when someone says, "Oh, I don't have the time," and then sits and watches TV for 2 hours, it's not hard to put on your Instant Pot or turn the oven on and throw something in, or wait for a bread to rise. And I am heartened, in fact, by the fact that many people have turned to baking, Jeremy especially, during this time you're sitting at home. And I think they're beginning to realize this actually wasn't so difficult. They're telling me that I should buy, a loaf of dough and make my pizza with that, when actually it takes 5 minutes to mix the dough. It's not a difficult thing. You just have to, it's just a little know-how. And I think people being at home have begun to realize that they have time and they're not commuting. Why not just cook and and enjoy it? And if you mess up, so what? You'll eat tomorrow. It's not a big deal. Can I direct to Jeremy, because he's been baking for a long time and tries out new things all the time. And I think you're probably baking more now, aren't you?
Yeah, can I play moderator for a second? Can I let
Sure.
Rachel respond to that? No, I want to let Rachel respond to that, but then I want to hear from Jeremy about pandemic baking. And I want to hear too from Chad about that, the reviewer's response to your essay and whether he is what his experience as an editor was, having paired these essays and then hearing from a reviewer that maybe they liked one better than the other or were upset about. There are differences too in your approaches. So I have questions for everybody. So I want Rachel to respond to Ken, and I want Jeremy to talk about pandemic baking, and I want Chad to talk about the reviewer's response to all these essays.
Sorry. I have a hard time.
Okay.
Sorry.
I've got, I think, 3 things to say. The first is just an aside. When I say Republican, I do not mean the Republican Party. Please, please, please. I'm talking about a long tradition of, the early American Republic, non-monarchical societies, non-aristocratic societies. So that's an aside. But back to Madeline's question, Madeline, again, thank you. On this question of balance, all of us individually can be Luddites or romantics on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and we can be sort of Democrats on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. It's an individual choice, and we're in a wealthy enough society. I don't think it's quite so easy when you come to making public or social decisions about what you should do about food. After all, this whole book about food fights is partly motivated, I think, Chad, by the rise of the food movement that clearly positioned itself as seeing the democratic and capitalist tradition as being one that needed to be done away with. And want to put in its place one that is very much inspired by the Romantic tradition. I mean, read Michael Pollan, it's just all there. You know, the appeal to nature, the appeal to individual satisfaction, and so on and so forth. So I think it's not enough to just say, you know, we can have it whichever way we want. I think there are real issues at stake, and I'll be happy to go on about them later in this discussion, but I want to hand over now to Chad and Jeremy.
No, Rachel, I think your point is a very good one, that on the one hand, on a personal level, we can have it both ways, but there really are real issues at stake. And in many ways, I was drawn into this because of my own personal love for cooking. I'm obsessed with cooking. I plan meals in my head throughout the day and then can't wait till I'm finished working and get downstairs and then get to do something creative that I can then consume, and then dishes are done and the whole creative process gets done in one evening, or sometimes over the course of weeks if I'm making something more complicated. But I think you're absolutely right that people who somehow imagine that this is that if we just simply reject modernity and go back and all cook like our grandmothers did, as Michael Pollan repeats endlessly and as Mark Bittman repeats endlessly, it's an incredibly sort of naive and romantic notion about the past. And we have to remember there's a reason that our grandmothers embraced tang over fresh squeezed orange juice. In part, it was cost. In part, it was also because they were tired of squeezing oranges. For example, I mean, then later on, of course, you get someone else, you get squeezed orange juice in the store. But there was a time when people literally would buy a sack of oranges and squeeze all the oranges and make orange juice. And you can see how something like tang would come along, which also points to Ken's point about that. I think we really are. We oscillate between based on our generation and what's going on. We oscillate between culinary modernism and culinary Luddism, and so that a little bit younger than Ken, but yeah, grew up in the 70s and early 80s when all these convenient foods were wonderful. We thought, but then as I got a little bit older, realized they're not nearly as good as the things that I really enjoy making myself. But I also think what this is related to all that, that one of the silver linings of COVID, and there haven't been terribly many, but it is the fact that people really are spending more time cooking and thinking about how, how they might prepare their own food. And I think that's helping people practice, because I think, when Ken, when you talk about it only takes 5 minutes, well, it takes you 5 minutes because you practice. And I practice cooking all the time. The things that friends come over and they say, how do you do this so quickly? And I don't really think about this every day, but when I do stop to think about it, it's because, well, I practice every day and I like practicing cooking food. And I want to point out to them, I also screw up a lot, and I'm not afraid of screwing up with the food, because very often, if you practice a lot and you cook every day and you're trying new things, then inevitably you're going to be ruining some dishes. So I think this, what COVID has done in a positive way is make people, or maybe sort of even the equation of the debate between culinary modernism and culinary Luddism, and that is people are now thinking more about making food at home. They're being forced to practice, and they are realizing that it's fun. At the same time, I thoroughly agree with Rachel's point that we do need to, or we shouldn't think of the past in such romantic terms, and that finding a healthy system outside of our own kitchens, but a healthy food system is something that's terribly important, and that's not just going to happen by rejecting modernity.
If I can jump in now, I don't want to address pandemic baking just yet, because I think it's a thing of its own. I want to say one thing that Rachel pointed out to me long ago about industrial cooking, and that is some things are so much better industrially produced. Olive oil, for one, possibly wine, Chad, I don't know, bladder presses and all the rest of it, maybe. We could, but salt, who the heck wants to, I mean, I know down in Sicily they're working on salt pans, but who the heck wants to earn a living making salt? Unless you are indeed a culinary Luddite. So I think there are some things about industrial food that are wonderful. I think the problem, I have a real problem with Rachel talking about how republicanism looks to science and nutrition, because for two reasons. First of all, it's so easy to get hung up in the sort of one person says this, the other person says that. I see this going on all the time now. Just today, people saying, well, you know, you can't say all processed foods are bad for you. Frying an egg is processing it. Well, yes, I know. But there's a difference between frying an egg and getting mechanically recovered meat and emulsifying it and adding hydrogen. You know, there's a difference. And I think we all know the difference. And you're not helping by saying all processed food is one thing or all processed food is another thing. So I think that it's to my mind, the thing about the return to nature versus the industrial food process. And this is where I don't fully agree with Pollen on many things, and I don't think it was Pollen who first said it, but I think in creating foods that fulfill an industrial niche, that is to say, that can travel long distances, that are shelf stable for a long time, that appeal to as many people as possible, I think you are creating foods that are not inherently as good for you as foods created from scratch. Now, they don't have to be created from scratch by you. I think that's an important lesson of the pandemic, is that, and I think this is what we're going to see coming out of the pandemic, and it'll feed into baking as well. But I think food cooked from scratch for the short term is inevitably going to be better for you. And that's really my main take on the difference between, quote, industrial food, unquote, and, quote, Luddite food, unquote. And I don't like either of the terms, frankly.
Well,
I want to give Rachel a chance to respond to this, because I think this gets at one of, and because she's urging us to talk about the real debate, there is a real debate here. And I get this question sometimes too, because I disagree with you, Jeremy. I don't think that ultra processed food is necessarily inherently nutritionally worse, and that the home artisanal sausage or reconstituted chicken patty is necessary. I don't. But I wonder, I don't know, I'm sure Rachel gets this question too, because she gives a full-throated defense of industrial production. I don't know, can people get you to pin your arm behind your back and say, yes, okay, truly ultra processed food is usually worse than home cooked food? Are you gonna, I don't know. What do you think about that? Because I don't agree.
No, I think it's not the processing. I think that's putting the emphasis in the wrong place. It's the product. You can have lightly processed foods that are bad for you and horrible, and you can have I hate ultra processed. It's the most vague and I think at the moment misleading word for food that we've got. The new, sorry, I've got a very bad connection. So yeah, I don't mind how much processing. I mean, you do have certain processed foods, Chinese condiments, for example, that have a shelf life of, you know, goodness knows how many years, and are shelf stable and travel. And I think that they've been around a long time. They're perfectly good. So from my point of view, it's not a question of how much processing. It's a question of whether the product is good for you or not. And some highly processed foods are and some aren't. And we're going through a lot of experimentation at the moment with a lot of new kinds of processing. And we're going to chuck a lot of it out, but I think it's worth doing. I do like Jeremy's point about the difference between you preparing foods from scratch and having foods prepared for you from scratch. Now, who's going to do the for you, and how are they going to be paid, and is it going to be a decent pay? If it is, I'm all for having other people prepare foods from, and I also don't like the word from scratch, because people talk about baking cakes from scratch or making bread from scratch. They're not. They're not. They're starting with highly processed products. Okay, but if somebody else can do it, so we'll leave the from scratch, but we'll keep having other people prepare food for us. Okay.
I really want to jump to this question that Nyla asks, which I think pokes at, so we've been laying out a vision where the home cooked, the natural or whatever is maybe probably the healthier, the more wholesome. But there is this question about how Luddism might deal with some other contemporary approaches to health, I think pokes in the other way, right? So Nyla asks, with the emphasis on taking time to cook and cook whole ingredients from scratch into elaborate meals, I wonder how diet planned meals, programs, and habits like tracking calories, macros, et cetera, fit into the picture. Do culinary Luddists see a place for tracking food in this way in their framework? I would imagine not. So if I'm correct, can you explain from a culinary Luddist perspective why counting calories and looking at food packages for calorie and serving sizes might be unnatural, or kind of, which is usually a practice, right, in the service of health? So are there ways that Luddism says, it's kind of like, screw that kind of health. We're not eating healthier, wholesome, home cooked food. No, we're going to eat this other stuff for, like, because your essay does not argue really for people improving their health outcomes by cooking. It's pleasure and accolades. So talk to me about Luddism and health. We've been mapping Luddism as health. What about Luddism as anti-health? I think that's for Ken.
Well, there's no doubt that you can cook things at home and it be very bad for you. You eat bacon every day and tons of butter and whatever the scientists decide is bad. And I want to sort of correct this misapprehension that somehow, because people want to cook themselves, that this is romantically backward or only looking to the past. I'm a modern person, and I don't think any other person would say, oh, I'm not going to use electricity, or I don't believe in this. And of course, flour, and I know this from personal experience, is very well made industrially, and it's a totally processed product. I've grown wheat, ground it by hand, sifted it myself. I've done all that, and it's a waste of energy and time. And I think modern. But in terms of health, I don't know whether I would agree that I don't know what's healthier for you and what's not. And obviously the nutritional fads make that very, very confusing to figure out. The last thing I would ever trust is what it says on a package, or read the calorie count, because it'll be, 6 servings are your 120 calories. And every now and then I'll look at something and I'll say, oh, 100 calories, that's good. And I realize, oh, I just ate 4 servings as a snack. So I would say, health is an entirely different matter. I would agree with Rachel that I think there are very highly processed foods that are not so good for you, and there are some very, made from scratch, whatever that means, foods that are bad for you also in the long term. But I think that what's really important here, and I'm just going to speak like a Marxist here completely, is that some things actually give you value to cook. Because if you've ever gone to a farmer's market or to a baker, then we have this little bakery here, the Geneva Bakery. The people who make the bread are there, and it's not the best bread in the world, but it's okay. And buying it from them, showing my appreciation, seeing the guy enjoy his customers there, even though I don't know what kind of living he makes, there's a connection between the consumer and the producer in a way that even if I buy a so-called artisanal bread that comes from the supermarket, I have no connection whatsoever. And I think that's the thing that's really, or one of the very important things that's missing from industrial food, is the anonymity, the distance that the food travels, the shelf stability, the industrial scale of the whole thing, which I don't think is necessary. I think, we grow fruits in California and ship them everywhere in the world because they grow best here, but everyone wants them year round. So we do it, even when we send bad tomatoes and terrible apples and things. So I think the problem is really more that corporations want to make money, and they figure out a way to do that, and then sell the food to people. And whether it's good for them or bad for them, they don't care really, and they don't care that the food just appears in this. I went yesterday to this kind of Costco kind of place, and I've never been to a Costco. This was like that, called Winco, and it was 6 times the size of the little grocery store that I usually go to. And there were people with enormous carts buying just huge boxes of, it was all processed food. There was nothing fresh there. And I thought, A, how do you consume all that? Is this your food for a month? How do you eat all that? But it was just like, so part of me thought, well, why even go there? Why not just have it delivered? Press on your phone, have it brought to your house. But the food was totally unconnected from any human interaction. And I think that's a very important part of being human. As Marx would say, our species being, what connects us to others is doing things that give us pleasure and help other people. And it's not just food, it's obviously the clothes we wear, the music we buy, rather than make it ourselves. And some people will tell me, oh, but I don't like to cook. Well, I'm bad at it. And so, and I say, well, there's some things everyone is not good at, like I'm not good at sports. I do like to do it though anyway, right? Even if I mess it up, and it's okay to cook and mess it up. It's not always going to taste better. It's not always going to be better for you, but I think it's an inherent human activity that gives us pleasure.
But
like singing.
I'm glad you turned to that, because as much as, and of course, the aesthetics of being able to buy food from somebody who made it, show your appreciation, like the connectivity, I'm not going to deny that. I mean, that's a rich pleasure that I enjoy too. But when we get into that, like, oh, it's about this connection that I feel to people at the restaurant or the place that I'm shopping, that strikes me as a place where a lot of forms of bias and racism and if I'm choosing my foods primarily based on I have a nice affinity connection with the person who made it for me, I think that brings up this set of questions that my students asked, which were really about racism and how it affects our food choices, and especially under pandemic, right? So these I'll read a couple of these, but there's a cluster of questions really about how the pandemic too is reshaping that. So Amrita asked, during the early pandemic, and it's still going on, people were avoiding eating at any sort of East Asian restaurant. Chinese takeout got the blame for this virus, particularly that some of our politicians were striving to connect carefully to China. Claire just points to the longstanding social inequities that have been accentuated, is her word, racism and health disparities, and how might food be affected by that, caught up in that? And Lauren also asked, with recent Asian hate crimes, how does this affect the culinary relationship people have with Asian cuisine? Does it aid in ignorance, like people trying to stay away from eating Chinese restaurants? Or what can we say about what's going on with, especially if we're turning to this, like, oh, food connects us and it connects us powerfully. Well, it can also divide us, and we can also use it to express all the not nice things that people express to each other. So I'm going to open that up to everybody, and this will kind of be my topic, and then I'll hopefully take some audience questions. But anybody on the panel who wants to talk about racism in the pandemic and what's going on with food and these connections to each other. Yeah, Rachel, go for it.
I want to have, and I really liked Amrita and Claire's and Lauren's question. I'm not going to address it specifically through the restaurant business, but through also the question that I can't find it now, but the question about eating alone and how do you match food preferences and dietary preferences with social life. And I think this is really a difficult issue at the moment, and I'd like to turn to my experience in Hawaii. I lived in Hawaii for 10 years. Hawaii, if you've never been there, looks like a tropical paradise. If you grew up there, you grew up in a society that is one of the most mixed race societies in the world. Many different parts of Asia, many different parts of Europe and the United States, and many different parts of the South Pacific, all converged in the islands. And trying to create a civil and civic society in the islands has been the job since statehood in 1959. And food has played an incredibly important role to overcome the racism that many groups felt are one for another. And it's taken the following form: that you must eat other people's food, that the most rude thing you can do, and I mean, this is not just Hawaii, but is more generally, is to say to somebody who offers you food that you don't want to eat it. And you may not like it, but you put on a smile and you eat it, and you express respect and appreciation for this gift. And one of the things I think that is worrying in modern American society is that even now, even children at McDonald's or in the home have, oh, they don't like it, we must give them a choice. I think one really important, because we do believe we are what we eat, and if you refuse to eat somebody else's food, you're saying you don't want to be like them. So to the question of food and racism and how we can come together, I think making an effort to eat other people's food and understand it and enjoy it, even if it's not what we would prefer or think nutritionally ideal, has to be an important social action. You don't have to do it all the time or every minute, but I think it's really crucial. If we all go our own way and eat what we think is the best diet for me and the food I like best, how do we create a society?
I think all that sort of relates back to the point when Jeremy brought up the things of what the food is, what is best for you. One of the questions that I immediately wanted to ask was, you mean best psychologically or best physiologically? And then Ken actually talked about that a little bit by saying what is really important is giving meaning to food. And so that's what matters, is having some connection, so that there's whatever the physiological component, whatever the food scientists, the nutritionists tell us about food, that's one thing. But there's the psychological component of having a connection to the food that comes from either making it yourself or having someone make it, or having a connection with the baker because it's a cash transaction, but you go to that baker every day or twice a week. And that's something that I think that really is incredibly important, because food is both something that affects our body, but it also affects our mind. And I think that's a really key distinction, well, the fact that it does both those things is very important to acknowledge. And that sort of leads me into the question, if I can just go back a little bit to the student whose name I'm forgetting, I apologize, but who asked about counting calories. I think certainly people who have done counting calorie programs have often found them to be quite helpful in terms of moderating the amount of food or getting them to think more about the food that they consume. And I think that's very important. But I think the big change that needs to be made, perhaps especially in American society, and one that I really feel like it's easy to romanticize the French and the Italians and the Chinese, in the way they eat. But I think there is some truth to the way we think about food is very often embodied in the question, did you get enough? Whereas you go to France or Italy or China and did you eat well? Did you eat well? And that's a very different question, I think. And if you focus on eating well, and that relates to, does this food have meaning for you in the way that Ken and Jeremy were talking about, I think almost naturally you begin to eat less, because you care more about the connection that the food gives you to the people around you. But that doesn't mean it can't be from some place you don't know. It doesn't mean that it can't be highly processed, as we've all said, but somehow creating meaning with the food and then with the people you eat. And that gets to Rachel's point, which is that trying other people's foods, accepting it, thinking about it, enjoying it the best you can, learning to enjoy it by practicing. All of those things I think are incredibly important and help to create both immediate meaning for your food, but also a broader societal not meaning, but sort of a cohesiveness, I think, that Rachel says exists in places like Hawaii, for example. But I think we can expand that too, if we're curious about food, and try to make a connection between ourselves and the food we're eating. Whether that's making it ourselves, having someone we love make it for us, or even again just making a connection with the merchant who's selling it, or whether it's at the farmer's market, although that can be a very elitist thing, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be even a supermarket, but maybe your favorite supermarket, every time you go, you run into the same people who work there. Talking to them helps to create meaning in food too, in a way I think it's very important.
Can I jump in very briefly
Please do.
on meaning and food? I think one of the I'm gonna go out on a limb. There's a sort of moral hierarchy to picky eating. When vegetarians, vegans come to dinner at my place, I cook them vegetarian food. I've not knowingly had a vegan to dinner. I've never knowingly been offered a pork chop when I go to visit my vegetarian friends for dinner. And there's an assumption that my preferred foods are somehow ascendant to your preferred foods. And I've had people tell me, oh, I can't handle meat. You know, you handle all sorts of things. I'm not insisting that I get one. I've never even been offered a pork chop at a vegetarian. So I'm just going to stick that out there about picky eating.
Well, it's also because the assumption is you can do very fine on any vegetables, whereas a vegetarian person cooking a pork chop, it is upset. If they morally object to it, I wouldn't expect to be offered it. But let me point out that I live with a vegetarian and cook for my wife, and it's actually kind of fun. I mean, it's a challenge because I often cook my own thing and cook the other stuff. But I have 3 people in my household now who eat completely different things. What can you do? You try and pick a few things that everyone, give everyone choices and see what gets eaten. But I always have a lot of leftovers. That's what it means.
But it's also a very American thing, I think, in a way that
Yeah.
it's very hard to be a vegetarian in France, for example, because
Or in Italy,
or in China, because the whole notion that somehow everybody gets to choose their own food is sort of anathema in those societies where the very purpose of food is that we all, not only do we break bread together, so to speak, but we then consume the same bread. And so it's very American. It's sort of, by focusing on individual needs and desires, in some ways it defeats the very purpose of communal eating, at least in some food philosophies. And that makes sense. I mean, I think I try to create for my family, food that everyone's going to like, but I don't have a lot of tolerance for, my kids say, well, I don't like that, I'm not eating that. It's like, well, this is what we're having tonight, and this is what, and eating it is being part of the community.
But Charles, what happens on that rare occasion when you say, man, I want escargot so badly, or I'm making octopus tonight, and the kids go, well, I'm not going to forgo it from now on. So you make something else. So, I know I gave up long ago trying to get my kids to eat everything I eat, but I think it was also an unfair expectation on my part, because I do eat as weird as stuff as I can get my hands on.
I do want to turn to audience questions, but I think this question of whether or not it's important that we eat together and whether or not it's important that we eat the same things do start. I mean, they poke at and take us back to some of the questions that we started with too, of like, what are the things that are important in your culinary philosophy? Is it the togetherness? Is it any grocery store that you can have a personal relationship with the employees, which you could do in any commerce engagement? Or are there some kinds that we're supposed to be pursuing because they are aesthetically superior, because they're more wholesome or natural or whatever? And that doesn't relate to this question, but that question of like, do we all have to eat the same thing? Especially under pandemic, right? There's a lot of like, oh, we can't eat together, but maybe if we all show up to a park with our own separate thing, then we can be together and we're not eating together. Is that not conviviality? it doesn't necessarily feel the same as the conviviality of sharing the same foods, but maybe there are ways that we can take parts of these things where we can get them. Please start dropping questions if you want in the chat, and I'll try and read at least a few of them, or you can use the raise hand function and we'll try it. So I've got one raise hand. Let me read Michelle's and give people a chance to respond to that, and we'll at least get Antonio's. So Michelle Moon asks, it seems to me the philosophy missing between the two poles of romanticism and scientific Democrats is utilitarianism. How do we bring these ideals together and maximize the greatest good across many dimensions of value? And I have to say that reminds me of a question that a student had asked too, about not just how things can divide us, but whether or not food could pivot us to bringing us together over these issues of race and identity. So I'll throw that to the panel, whoever wants to take on. What about utilitarianism? Is there a kind of, everybody wants a coming together moment because we're moving towards the end. Does anybody have a coming together moment for me regarding this?
Well, utilitarian, I assume you're talking, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, but they're part of that whole progressivist, philosophy that said we should trust science and they will give us all the answers. And by and large, I think, as most people do, right? I mean, not that you don't have a choice, but I think most of science, most rational people will trust, every now and then they make a mistake. Oops, trans fats. Guess they weren't better for you than butter. And mistakes are made, and that's not to discredit science or believe that there's some kind of polarity here that I think most people, sensible people, will just say, yeah, of course we want the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. If we really believe that, we would have things like minimum wages and better working conditions and so on and so forth. We would really take account the happiness of everyone, not the wealthiest. And I think sometimes capitalists, business orientation, corporate interests really need to be curbed by the state. I think that's just something that that's not being romantic. That's just being, practical, the good of everyone. So I'm glad thank you for throwing that word in there. It's useful.
The way that I sometimes would put this is, I don't care if everybody does cook, but it would sure be nice if they could, if they wanted to, right? Like I'm not going to force them, but did somebody else want to answer that, or I can go to Antonio? Did Jeremy or Rachel or Chad want to weigh on is utilitarianism a different way to think about shared value, or should I bounce to?
I'd put it like Ken does in what he calls the progressive or democratic tradition. It's got problems, obviously. We don't have time to go all through those now, and I'd like to get more questions from the audience. So Michelle, maybe we can talk later about that.
I think I've managed to unmute Antonio. Go ahead.
Thank you, Margot. I thoroughly enjoyed this panel, and Rachel, I enjoyed also your piece on culinary modernism. I'm going to try to ask a question so I'm very interested in how these topics intersect with issues of, can you hear me? I don't know. Okay. I'm interested in how these topics that we've talked about today intersect with issues of identity, resilience, and individuality. For context, the identity piece, I see these issues as being very dynamic. I was born in Venezuela to a Syrian family from Aleppo, and I grew up in the US. My mom felt compelled to recreate a lot of the labor-intensive Arab dishes at home, where we are isolated from a broader Arab community. And so it's interesting that for her, cooking was very much a chore, similar to what you described in your piece, Rachel. But for me, I got the opportunity before the war broke out in Syria to go back I did a Fulbright there in 2010 to 2011, and I studied the traditional food practices. And, I came back to the US, I partnered with a local potter to make a clay pot, and now I make like yogurt in a clay pot, and I'm trying to preserve a lot of these traditional food practices. So I feel like I'm interested in hearing more about how the identity piece intersects. On resilience, in light of the war in Syria, I also noticed, as part of my ongoing research, that a lot of the traditional food practices bring about resilience in the sense that people know how to transform milk into yogurt, and people know how to preserve and ferment dishes as a part of, like, I think Ken talked about it earlier, as part of like a culinary know-how. So how does industrialization impact our resilience as a society? And lastly, on the individuality, a lot of people talked about bouncing and oscillating between the two ends of Luddism and modernism. I found it very interesting that in Aleppo, people refer to tomatoes that were grown in the winter as Benedora plastikie, like plastic tomatoes. But it's also interesting, you know, I'm here, and especially during the pandemic, I took on sourdough baking. But in Aleppo and Syria, no one really thought would bake bread alone. Bread was seen as a communal thing. You'd go to it, like you would rely on a baker. And I do think this notion of individuality is to me sometimes at odds with even romantic ideas of cooking. Like, and I don't know, I feel like that notion of like, it strikes that balance, because like people don't want poor tasting tomatoes, like tomatoes that taste bad that were grown in the winter. But also in Aleppo, at least, people relied on their community to bake these well-produced products as opposed to trying to do everything at home alone. So that's a loaded question. You don't feel free to, you don't have to like go to all of it, but you know, issues of identity, resilience, and individuality. Thank you so much.
On the resilience, yes, it's useful to know how to do things from scratch in bad circumstances. We are all making trade-offs all the time about being self-reliant and living in a modern society. And when you get a breakdown in a modern society, as happened in Syria, if you have those traditional skills, it's useful. But on the other hand, you know, how much time do you have? It's a really difficult one. On the identity, yes, obviously, I mean, there's screeds and screeds written on this. And when your very existence is under threat, of course, you are going to want to resort to maintaining as much of that identity as you can. And thank you for reminding us about the fact that America is such a weird and untypical place, and that we should not make all our judgments about food based on American experience.
Yeah. Can I also add to this that I have a class which is starting in an hour that my students are from everywhere in the world, and some of them are actually in those places now since the pandemic also. But I find that they have this, because they eat everything from everywhere in the world, because they have so many different options. If they want Japanese, if they want Korean, if they want Mexican, they want whatever, they can get it. Is that holding on to the foods of their ancestors helps them perform their identity, helps them remember who they are, and especially if they're mixed heritage, or just sort of reminding themselves of who they are and remembering those recipes. I think that's an important thing. I think it's one of the great values of food history, is just not to forget what people did in the past and what they enjoyed and where we came from, right? And sometimes to be very thankful that we're not there anymore, because sometimes modern plumbing is a great thing. And if you had to depend on yogurt you made yourself, it would be harder than buying it in the store. And the stuff you buy in the store is very good, in fact.
or it isn't. And
Antonio, I think you raise a very good point, though, because so much has been forgotten, though. And one of the big problems that we have in American society, certainly for those who want to promote better eating, they often run up against the fact that giving people food, or not giving them, but saying, look, kale is healthier than this, you should really try it. But then when you put kale in front of a lot of people, they look at you and they say, what do I do with this? I have no clue. Tell me, I don't have the knowledge about how to turn this into a dish that I would actually want to eat. So that's one of the great problems that we face is how to keep alive, or how to perhaps not just keep alive, but sort of revivify the food knowledge on a very broad basis. So I don't think there's any clear answer to that, because as Rachel points out, there are good things that come from, it's all trade-offs. There are wonderful things that come from food modernity, if you want to call it that. We're spending so much less of our budget now, certainly in developed Western countries, on food than previous generations. And that in many ways is a blessing, because that gives us time and to spend and money to spend elsewhere on other things like books or music or whatever it might be that couldn't be done previously. At the same time, there's an obvious trade-off when you don't know when you don't have the knowledge to how to produce that food. It creates a problem. So again, there's always, it's cliche, but it is always a series of trade-offs that keep this question and these questions going around and around and around.
Part of the trade-offs are invisible because we're paying the cost of the externalities. So, you know, you've got your cheap food and you've got your dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and lots of other things. I want to just say one thing. First of all, I've never eaten better food than I did in Aleppo. I've been a few times long ago, and wow. But that's not that. The thing about baking, I just briefly want to beat the drum for pandemic baking, which was people learning how to do things. It was people recovering, maybe not even their own tradition, but somebody's tradition. And it gave people an insight into how to turn flour, water, salt if you need it, yeast, sourdough, whatever, into a deeply delicious thing. And I don't know how many people are going to continue baking if they don't have to. I'm not really bothered. But I want to say one thing about community bakers. In Aleppo, there's a bakery. There are 2 bakeries on every corner. It's not just one. Everybody is a baker. Every block has a baker. Every block has 2 bakers, 3 bakers. What I want to see post-pandemic is somehow small, community-supported bakeries, not just a person on a bicycle, but a small shop making good use of a decent-sized oven, working by hand, adding value to the bread, paying themselves a decent wage, and creating that fundamental aspect of a culinary food shed. Because the bread is central, whether it's flatbread or a loaf bread or a cracker, doesn't matter. It is central. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for people to get into small-scale baking for a small-scale community. And I'm absolutely fascinated to read last week that the Western company, George Weston Limited, is putting its bakeries up for sale. Weston, more than anybody else, starting in the 1880s, Weston invented industrial bread, model bakeries in Toronto, all sorts of good things. They have decided that baking bread is not as profitable as selling bread because they're keeping their interest in Loblaws, the biggest grocery chain in Canada, but they're selling their bakeries. They sold their US bakeries 2 years ago. There is such an opening after the pandemic for people who've tasted good bread, but maybe don't want to make their own anymore. Where are they going to get it? I'm going to leave on that polemic.
You could extend that from bread to so many other products. Good local cheese, good local, I mean, everything that doesn't necessarily need to be manufactured in large volumes and shipped halfway across the country. Good butchers, good, you know, everything.
Let's start with bread, Ken.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And yet all the gluten-free people will feel so left out. I don't know, Chad. I think you can live a long and happy life without ever finding a way to prepare kale that you'll like, or that I'm banking on it. I'm hoping. I know you do. I just
throw it in a pot. What do you need to know?
I'm just exhausted by it. I am not going to abuse our panelists' time by keeping us here long after the hour, even though I know that who wouldn't want to have questions for them. Instead, I'm going to thank them also so much for doing this. I have been looking forward to it forever, and it has more than exceeded my grandest expectations. And I'm so glad I can make the recording available to people. I'm not going to force people to leave. I don't have to go just yet. I have office hours in a little bit, but I am going to stop the recording so that it doesn't go on forever. And then let people go, especially my students, feel released. If you did not already, thank you guys so much for your amazing questions. And we're going to talk about this for the rest of the semester.